Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Olympia Unitarian Universalist Congregation, where we commit to live out our vision of an interconnected world that is loving, just, and healthy. I'm the Reverend Mary Geer, and I'm honored to serve as the minister here. In our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we light a chalice, and so we will do that shortly. I just want to note that we are recording this talk today. We're also live streaming it to Zoom and YouTube. The camera is back there, so if you want to stay off camera, you can stay in the back or head out that way if that's of concern to you. So we will light our chalice with words from Anastasia Barosh, titled Origin Story. We kindle this chalice not only because it originated in antiquity, but because the symbol combats malice. This burning flame represented hope during the bleakness of World War II, a sign of refuge, meaning death was circumvented, if only for that night. This emblem, a flame and a chalice encircled twice, assured weary refugees fleeing Nazi persecution that for a time they had found safety and respite. Today, this beacon, shining bright, reminds us to summon the strength to extend care and love to those in need forthright. We ignite this flame today for our shared humanity. Thank you so much for gathering here today to hear Harriet's story. We were really blessed to have her connected with us from a OUUC congregant and neighbor. We have named this a Faith in Action Forum because you will hear in Harriet's story how the values of her family were put into action in opposition to what was happening in her home country of Germany and in Europe. We are currently facing threats to our democracy here in the United States, and it is a foundational part of our Unitarian Universalist faith that is not a political statement, but that we stand with our values, our shared values of pluralism, interdependence, justice, as we focused on our stories, our history, and all of what we know and what has been handed down. And so with great gratitude, we welcome Harriet today, and I'll turn it over to Reverend Sarah for a short introduction.
It'll be a very short introduction because you already said part of what I was going to say. So we welcome Harriet, who is a member of our larger Olympia community and connected with us through a neighbor and said, I have a story to share. And so we met and talked about how to do that, and hence this forum. Harriet has been a long-time member of the larger Olympia community, and we are welcoming currently today many friends and neighbors of Harriet's, a testament to her connection with this community. So thank you for being here to share your story with us today, Harriet.
So do I have to turn this on, or is it? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Reverend Sarah, Reverend Mary, for inviting me to come and speak to people today. So I wrote a memoir a while ago to honor my parents. They were very...
I'm just going to move this out of your way.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. My parents were very, very brave, and I needed to tell their story, especially to my 20 nieces and nephews who really knew nothing of the family's history. So I feel that I have to speak a lot about my parents' story because that's what sets the tone. You know, mine was relatively minor. I was born in 1939, so I was 5 years old, 6 years old when the war ended. But the whole thing about Nazism was set up much earlier. So what my parents experienced had a profound influence on my life, and I think even what they experienced before I was born, because it set the stage for what they experienced later. So again, I was born in Munich, Germany, and there was great turmoil in Germany after World War I. And so there was massive starvation because there was not adequate scant harvest because so many men had been sent off to war. And when they came back, there was a massive unemployment because they were not there to do their job, and the women who had replaced them were dismissed from their jobs so the men who did come back could work. But and there was incredible hyperinflation. I saw my grandfather's memoir, my paternal grandfather's memoir, and he had million-mark bills preserved there. Million marks bought almost nothing. And my mother used to have to go early to meet my father after work when he got paid and spend the money on food before the money lost value. So the inflation was terrible. And out of this, there arose a really incredible turmoil between what were called the Reds and the Whites. The Whites were the royalists, and they were anxious to go back to the king. He was kind of a benign figure, and they loved him. But they also were used to that way of functioning. But there was also tremendous interest in communism because of the Russian Revolution. So there were fights in the streets. And when my mother was in medical school, she would see dead bodies in the streets. She told me that she lived in a garret, cold. She had to wear all her clothes at once. And she would walk to the school, the University of Munich, and see dead bodies in the streets from the turmoil that had occurred during the night. And that led to the rise of gangs of people who were later identified as brown shirts because they wore discarded uniforms in the First War. So, and these brown shirts coalesced around a fiery speaker named Adolf Hitler. And they formed a party, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, the NASPD. And he started to run for office. So Ellen Ammann was a Swedish woman who had married into Bavaria, had married an orthopedic surgeon, and she lived in Munich. And in 1918, the women's movement had been very strong in Bavaria and in Germany in general, and they received full rights. They were able to vote, and they were able to run for office in 1918. So she ran for office and was elected to the Bavarian parliament. And a delegation of women that were part of the German part of the International League of Women for Peace and Freedom tried to go to the Minister of the Interior in Berlin and say, here's this guy running for office, but he's not a citizen. How can you let him run? He's not German, he's Austrian. There wasn't a great distinction between the two because the language was the same, but nevertheless, he is an Austrian and not qualified to run. And the minister said, well, he lived in Austria right across the river from Germany. And they said, well, if that was a communist who was doing that, you wouldn't let him run. He said, well, yeah. So anyway, they were unsuccessful. And Hitler never forgave my grandmother for having humiliated him by trying to keep him from running for office. He ran for office twice, and he was defeated by Hindenburg both times. And so he ran again but was unsuccessful, and so he was still just agitating. And he agitated against foreigners, against Jews particularly. And so so the party was forming, and people like Goebbels and Himmler and Heydrich were men who formed the party ahead of his coming into office. They were planning how to run the country ahead of time. So after Ellen went with this delegation to the Interior Minister, she heard from contacts that she had that these women were in danger of losing their heads. And she said, you have to get out of Munich. And they said, well, we can't get out of Munich. All our function is here. But they did move to the suburbs of Munich to a place where they were safe. But still, there was this idea that the women who had participated in trying to keep him out of the country were in danger of death. So Hitler came to power. No, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but I'm a little nervous, I'm sorry. Ellen Ammann warned the people more or less the night before the so-called beer hall putsch happened. This beer hall putsch was a coup. Hitler was going to take over the Bavarian government and then with his cohort of brown shirts march to Berlin and take hold of the Weimar Republic. So Ellen Ammann was able to hear because a friend of hers overheard a couple of brown shirts talking. And so they said, Hitler's going to take over the country, and, it's going to happen tomorrow. And so Ellen managed to send her youngest son on a bicycle to contact the officials of the Bavarian government and come to her school for social work for women that she had started. And she said, here are some cars, get out of town and take some bread along, because you don't know how long it's going to be until you eat again. So she got them out of town, and Hitler went to the beer hall. He shot a pistol into the ceiling of the beer hall. I don't know if that was commemorated later. But in any case, she also managed to get the government of Bavaria to call out the police and the militia. And so the next day when Hitler tried to take over, they stopped him. 16 of the brown shirts were killed and 4 police were killed, and no one really knows who started shooting. But Hitler was stopped in 1923, 10 years before he actually came to power. But all the time, between those 10 years, people were working on trying to form a government to their liking. And so one of the things they started was a concentration camp, which was called Dachau, after the medieval farm town where it was built in an old munitions factory. So Dachau was an experiment. It was to see how would people respond to that. Would they accept its presence as normal? Dachau was for political prisoners early on. It was not for the rest of the people who ended up there, the gypsies, the Roma, or the Jews, or the Russian prisoners of war coming back from the front. But political prisoners were people who had offended Hitler in any way. All right, what was an offense to Hitler? Refusing to make the salute. So there was an employee of my father's who always said Grüß Gott, which was a typical typical Bavarian greeting. It's also common in Switzerland. But, so he would always come to work and say Grüß Gott, and he was supposed to say Heil Hitler. So he was taken to a work camp, a sub-camp of Dachau, for 2 months because he refused to salute in the prescribed way. So he was a political prisoner. All right, so any simple things. Calling somebody a Nazi that belonged to the party was considered a crime, because Nazi was a pejorative term originally. And it was sort of like in this country when we call people from suburban, from farm country. I went to school in North Carolina, for instance, and the people from UNC and from the other universities, when they would come to play games, would have nasty names for us. You know, the farmers, we were called, because we're a school of agriculture and life sciences. But that calling, the Nazi originated from a common name in Bavaria, which was Ignaz, short for Ignatius. And so Ignaz became shortened to Nazi, and people who were considered, you know, uneducated farmers were called Nazis. But Hitler did not like that term because of its general meaning, and he considered it a crime if somebody used it, and put them into Dachau, or to a sub-work camp, of which there were 140 before he came to power in Bavaria alone. And so, you know, so there was an ambiance of fear growing, that people would be afraid to be incarcerated for trivial reasons. Later, when I was old enough to go to school, and I would go about 1 kilometer from our house, and there was this little camp with a chain link fence with people in striped clothing working. And I was kind of friendly, and I said, "Hi, good morning, how are you?" And I'd chat with them. But I didn't know, it had no sign that said it was a work camp, that was a sub-camp of Dachau. All right. And I didn't really learn what the men were doing until my spouse and I went to Dachau in the 1990s and heard about the things that they were working on in that camp, were the cement slabs from which the barracks in Dachau and other concentration camps were built. So my father was an engineer, and he was offered a job. He had studied aircraft engineering, aircraft engines, and he was offered a job with BMW. And they manufactured engines. They were not allowed to manufacture planes, but they could manufacture the engines. That and their motorcycles saved BMW from bankruptcy. So they sold them to England, to Japan, and elsewhere, and even to the US Postal Service, because they could fly from New York to San Francisco and elsewhere, long distances over high mountains without problem. So anyway, in 1938, my father realized that BMW was starting to build planes. And so he knew that war was imminent. And he decided he would take the family and say he was going on vacation to Sweden, to his wife's mother's island in the Skärgård of Stockholm. But the night before, 2 Gestapo men visited my father, and they said, "Well, you can go, but you can leave your 3 youngest children here as surety that you will come back and go to work." So they did not go. I was not the youngest at the time. I was afterwards. I was in my mother's womb at the time. So in a way, I can say I was influenced very early by the Gestapo. All right, so he came back, and then the war started in 1939, and he was also the general secretary of a religious social organization at the time that was interested in trying to deal with the turmoil that had happened after World War I in Germany, and to restore some kind of social consciousness. It was called Quickborn. And they had a a place to meet, and they would meet for conferences and lectures and entertainment. They would dance with one another. And my mother and father courted there. And they eventually did marry, and they had to go over the border into Poland to be able to marry. Right, so he was general secretary of the Quickborn and had a membership list. And so the Quickborn was outlawed in 1938, and so the Gestapo visited my parents' home again. And he had a warning from someone in the police that they were coming, and he got every remnant of information about Quickborn into a farm cart and put a tarp over it, and my oldest brother wheeled it out of the yard as the Gestapo were coming in. And they searched the house, and they could not find anything. But my mother always thought they had found something. They had found a letter from her younger brother, who was a Benedictine monk, and he had been preaching because Hitler had, as one of his first decrees, said that women could not be practicing their profession if they were married and had children. They were to stay home and raise children for the Reich to replenish the armies. My footnote. So in any case, I got lost in the weeds there for a minute. So her younger brother was a Benedictine monk, and his religious name was Pater Amsel. Pater for being a priest, Amsel was a saint's name. He sang so beautifully in the choir, they called him Pater Amsel, which is a German word for thrush. And so he had been preaching against what Hitler was doing to handicapped people and what he was doing to Jews. And so the Hitler regime said he has to go. And his prior managed to get him into the army. And he worked as a stretcher bearer and as a medic and was sent to the Crimea to fight the Russians at that point. So okay, weeds again. So his commanding officer had gotten a letter saying, he is not fit to serve in the army. He has to be thrown out of the army, and basically so he could be killed. So his commanding officer said, I know him very well, he's beloved by the men in his company, and if he is not fit to serve in the army, I'm not either. And he wrote a letter to that. And then he asked the company, would you sign this letter? And all of them did. So, but Uncle Hans, my Uncle Hans, the younger brother of my mother, did not fight. He was, again, a medic in the Crimea, and they won a very bad battle, and he was killed by a fragment from a piece of shrapnel from an exploding bomb. So, all right. So the point I wanted to make about Dachau was completed before Hitler came to power. So my grandmother died in November of 1932. Hitler came to power in January 30th of 1933. In March of 1933, Dachau received its first shipment of political prisoners. So I have often heard that the Holocaust did not start with concentration camps, but my assertion is it did. It also, the burning of books. The women who had protested Hitler had all of their they were banished and had all of their writings, their books that they had written, destroyed. And the woman who wrote a biography of Ellen Ammann had all her books destroyed. I have a copy, I think maybe the only remaining copy that was given to my Uncle Albert. So, but they basically were deprived of their ability to run their if they were lawyers, they were not allowed to be lawyers anymore. If they were judges, they were no longer judges. If they studied medicine, they could not practice their profession. And my mother never practiced medicine, even though she had an advanced degree in pediatrics and was certified. And by the way, her medical license, which was at the time when all the hyperinflation was going on, cost 20,000 marks at the time, just simply to get certified. So, so far I've talked only about my parents. My mother, I did not talk enough. She did not practice medicine, but she moved to Munich, and we had a double lot, and she planted enough food to get us through the winter. And she planted fruit trees and berry shrubs for food to keep us going. And she rented a field to grow sugar beets, and she boiled sugar beets down to syrup and traded that out for lack of sugar in the general population. So, and I remember the smell of that cooking of sugar beet, and it really kind of made me sick to my stomach, because it made me hungry. Right? We were very hungry, but my mother made us enough for us to survive she also kept sheep, and she kept banty roosters and hens, and so we had eggs and meat and wool for sweaters. Like I have on the front page of my memoir, a sweater that my mother knit from the wool of our sheep. So the women who had been active in trying to banish Hitler were surprised the morning that the coup actually happened, and saw all the soldiers in the streets. And that was another experiment, to see soldiers become a normalized part of life, and to have the camps be a normalized part of life, so that you were constantly afraid to do anything to contradict the regime. You would immediately suffer. And my father repeatedly was reminded at work, as long as I remember your mother, you will not go to a KZ, a concentration camp. And others would say, as long as I remember your mother, you will go to a KZ. So there was this idea that this kind of behavior, the camps, well, I'm not supposed to say anything political, so, but the idea of the camps was something that became normalized, that you simply could not do, and that strangers and people who were unwanted in the regime were confined in the camps. And so it was not just banning of books and targeting the press and making enemies from neighbors. Enemies from neighbors. My father, one evening, we were all in the living room listening to the BBC, and he heard a noise outside and went out, and it was a woman that he had driven to work when he still had a car and gas to run it. And he had driven her to work for quite a while, and she was outside his living room window, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "I was trying to see if you were listening to the BBC," which was a crime. All right, he said, "I'm not listening to the BBC," but he was very careful from then on. So how did that affect us as children? We were told to be quiet, not to say anything about what was going on in our house, not to say anything about visitors we might have. And one of the visitors we received through the action of the Quickborn. They were two sisters, Valerie and Andrea Wolfenstein, who decided they were in danger. They were Jewish, and people they knew were being disappeared. So they knew someone in Quickborn and contacted my father and that person contacted my father. And my father said, yes, we would be privileged to have them here. So Valerie came to hide with us in our home. So we could never say anything at all about who visited us. And my parents said, don't talk about who is here or who is not here. And he said, don't make any jokes. So my sisters were, there were two organizations. One was the BDM, the Band Deutsche Mädchen, the League of German Girls, which was patterned on the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth, by the way, was patterned on the U.S. Boy Scouts to start with. They thought it was ideal to have them have uniforms and be, sort of paramilitaries. So anyway, they made a joke. The members of the Band Deutsche Mädchen were encouraged to date the soldiers and to have children by them for the honor of the Reich. All right, so they were joking, and they said, the Band Deutsche Matratzen, the band of the League of German Mattresses. And so, and my parents said, don't you dare ever say that to anyone. Don't you joke, because that's very, very dangerous. You could be in danger. We could be in danger. And Mai could be in danger. Mai was how I knew Valerie Wolfenstein, her alias that she got when they decided to leave Berlin and fake suicide so they could escape the danger of being captured and transported off. And so she became Esther Mailand, and I knew her as Mai. And so during the bombing raids, she would comfort us she was just a wonderful person. I loved her. She taught me how to draw. She was an artist, and she really had an attitude for life. She lived to be 102 after the war. She survived very well. But she would be at our house for a period of time, and there would be the temperature would rise for my father, and he would transfer her to other Quickborn members. And so she was constantly moving, but she had no identification. She had a postal identification card that allowed her to travel. That was all that identified her. So towards the end of the war, there were relatives of my mother that had been bombed out of their home in the East, and they came to live with us. And so my mother registered them with the police, and she thought, well, why don't I register Esther Mailand also? And so she did, which again was a very courageous thing to do, because if she had been challenged, that would have been all. And so, I remember Mai very, very well, but you want to know maybe some of my experiences. Maybe I should tell you about what happened when I was working at the health department in Olympia. If you don't know, the Museum of Flight at the airport has some B-25 bombers, and B-25 bombers bombed Munich. And so I was walking with a colleague there, and I suddenly thought, something isn't right. Well, back in Germany, I was for a while, my father had taken us off to a country town where their bombing was not so heavy when I was in kindergarten. But an air raid happened, and that was part of the ambiance, the constant sound of the air raid siren. But she said, run home, but, keep to the fence lines, and if you see the planes coming, the bombers were always accompanied by low-flying fighter planes. And she said, if you see a plane coming, lie down next to the fence and make yourself as small as possible. Well, back in Olympia at the health department, I hear at the air show, the bomber is flying, and I suddenly feel I have to get in the ditch and make myself as small as possible. So I think it had some lasting effect to have bombers always in your life. And one of my first memories of that, my father was working with his local handyman digging an escape tunnel from our basement to the backyard in case our house was hit by a direct bomb and it collapsed, so we could get out of the basement. And then also, well, okay, I guess I can tell you enough. You get the general feeling of what it feels like to have bombs in your life all the time. Anyway, so thank you very much for listening to me. I was a little nervous about doing this. And I've given a lot of public addresses because in my work as a scientist, I've had to be at conferences. But I was never as nervous at doing this to you. So.
So we have time for questions now, and in order for your question to be heard, please wait for me to bring you the microphone. And if you're online, you can raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat, and Carbon will let us know in the room. I see one right here.
Thank you, Harriet. That was very important for me to hear, and I feel all of us. It just dawned on me when you were speaking about the women and classifications of people, of having fear of who they are, or really having their professions taken away. Recently on the news, and I'm not trying to be political, but there was a list of professions that are not going to be recognized as professions, and that's aligning with what you presented here today. And I'm a nurse over 50 years, and nurses were at the top.
Yes.
I was really interested when you mentioned how Dachau was built before Hitler came to power, and it made me think of how, for instance, in Shelton, a story that's come up from time to time is that they're trying to build this facility that the police department supports, but they say things like, oh, it's a mental health treatment facility, and there's care groups and things like that. But because the police happen to be involved, I get kind of skeptical of new facilities like that. What are your recommendations when governments are trying to build facilities like this that could easily be transitioned into something more nefarious?
Well, people have often, when I've asked to speak to different groups, they've asked me to give them an action plan of how to deal with situations today. And I said, if I had an action plan, I'd be doing it. But I think there are many, many action plans. Each person can do what they can. They can write to their legislators. They can, hold protest signs. They can march together and show the unity that we are together. And all of those are what can be done in order to resist any nefarious thing that we hear. But again, the Nazis had, and I use the term deliberately, the Nazis had done away with the freedom of the women. The women had gotten full rights to not only vote and to run for office, but to be in all the professions, and that was done away with the Nazis. And so, you might see that coming again, as Kim has pointed out. Nursing is not to be considered a profession anymore. And
thank you for sharing your story and these stories with us today. We heard in our church service before this about hope. As you share this story and as you remember these things that happened in your lifetime, and as you see the things that are happening now, not just in this country but in the world around us, what do you hope, if there's just one thing that people might receive when you share these stories, what do you hope that is?
well, I hope that they will draw their own conclusions about what is happening today, that they might see some similarities and take what action they can do, because every action is important. It forms a part of the whole, and community is important. To know that there are people that you can trust with their lives. That's what happened with my parents in the Quickborn. They could trust those people, and they were working to try to restore Germany at the time when all this stuff was, and they were banned when that happened. But the community they had created that kept them together so they could trust each other with their lives and say, yes, we'll take you for shelter, we'll hide you. That's important.
And we have a question online. So Jim writes, how does your distress during your girlhood compare with any distress for you in the U.S. now?
I'm sorry, you have to tell me again.
So it was, how does your distress in your girlhood compare with any distress for you in the U.S. now?
Well, how do you feel? I don't think I can point out any one single thing. It seems to get worse every day. So, yeah.
Yes. When did your family decide to leave Germany, and how did that come about?
Well, my parents had decided to leave Germany to go to Sweden, and had hoped that would be successful, but at the cost. If they had left their children behind, they would not have survived. So they did not leave their children behind. But at the end of the war, all right, my father was the only remaining so-called official of the BMW that was left in their major plant. And he was told that he could have 400 weapons for 4,000 men to defend that for the Allied armies. And he said to himself, he said, that's suicide. And he said, you go home. And they went home. And then the Allied armies came, and he surrendered the plant to the U.S. Army. They put him on a Jeep because the plant was partially destroyed, and it was windy, and it made a lot of noise as the wind blew. And they sat him in front of a machine gun on a Jeep and drove him through the plant. And then they said, all right, were you a member of the party? And he said, no, he was not, and he was not. And so they then said, okay, you will be vetted, and then you can go home. And then he was made mayor of the small suburb of Munich, Ammann, and was at that function for a while. And his contact with the U.S. Army came to him and said, if you want to go to America, you can go tomorrow. We can let you know. And he said, I don't want to. I want to be able to rebuild Germany. And they said, well, tough. You just lost a war. You lost a war, and you're ours. You are a prisoner of the Army Air Force, and so is your whole family. And you will go where we take you. And so they took him off, and we did not know where he was going. He was then, and we found out he was in various cities, and we followed him somewhat. But eventually he, had to leave the country, and he, my mother argued with him, can you stay? Can you possibly stay? But, and he said, no, I can't. And so he was taken off as part of Operation Paperclip, which took engineers and scientists from Germany to America to use them. So Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist, was a prize capture, and so he came to start our space program here in this country. But he was treated specially. My father's group was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and we were considered the property of the U.S. Army Air Force. And so basically that went on for 2 years until Adenauer was elected and a peace treaty was signed with Germany, and then we could apply for U.S. citizenship at that time.
So we have another question online. Thank you for your memories and stories. What other parallels do you see today from your experience in pre-World War II?
Well, stoking fears of outsiders is one that comes to mind. Defunding the arts, defunding education, making enemies of neighbors, targeting the press, banning books, make Germany great again. Oh, I'm sorry, make US great again, which was a slogan at the time. So I think those are some of the parallels we can see, and we can see the horror of the way that immigrants are treated, and that they're confined and not have the backing of the law behind them, even though our Constitution requires it.
Thank you, Harriet. I was not prepared to actually stand up and speak, but your courage and your stories, I think, should embolden all of us to do whatever we can to join with community and galvanize each other. And on that note, you've mentioned the League of Women. I'll say a little shout out for the League of Women Voters of Thurston County. And so we're currently inviting the community, along with other League members, to attend a training that that we're doing called Know Your Rights. And the trainers are from the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Support Network. It's a free training. You can come. I'll leave a few flyers if that's okay, and I hope I'm not being too shameless. But thank you so much for your courage in telling the story. We need to hear it more than once.
Well, thank you, Carol. And that I'm speaking with a fellow Mosketeer, as we call ourselves. We stand outside the mosque in Lacey every Friday while they're at prayer, just to watch their backs. And that was a request of Indivisible. Mo, the baker of Smiling Mo's Cookies, was the one who asked us to come and stand, and we've been standing since 2017. So that's just, and that kind of thing, the Muslims were really banned in 2017, and they're banned again. And to help protect them from the evil, we have to deal with it.
Thank you, Harriet. My heart's pounding. I'm very nervous, too. You did really well, Harriet.
Thank you. Thank you.
I grew up, I was born in Germany after the war, and I grew up in East Germany, and I see the parallels between the Nazis, East Germany, and now.
Yeah.
I grew up with people being afraid, people being watched, a spy in every place where someone lived. It's not quite like that here yet. But what do I want to say? I always thought, I thought when I came to the United States that this would be a safe place. I had this illusion about what America was, actually. But that was really shattered quite immediately when I saw the differences of how people were treated depending on their color. I was a teenager. I had no idea it was going to be like that. I thought I was going to live in a land where everyone got along and lived together.
Yeah.
But coming from East Germany, briefly West Germany, I didn't understand the political stuff really. So I don't know where I was going with that, but anyway, I really appreciate the way you told this story and commend you for your courage to do that. I know you were nervous.
Yeah, that feeling, the persistent
It's
feeling of being watched all the time,
Yeah.
and to have that fear of your life, or to be incarcerated. You know, when you think of all the immigrants having constant fear that someone will grab them off the street with no recourse.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Uli.
My husband and I took our children to Dachau as part of a family vacation, and I don't even have words to describe what it was like there. I'm just wondering how much the common person in Germany knew what was happening in Dachau.
I don't think the common person in Germany knew very much about that. They didn't know. So, for instance, they saw the prison camps, and they knew they were prison camps, and they had some inkling of whether that was what they were, but they didn't know for sure. And so, you know, the pervasive feeling that, you know, that it was there and it was there for them was very common. And yes, we went to Dachau to see the horrible things that happened there. And, you know, that, and I've talked a lot with people about the conditions and what the populations were. So there were Jews and there were prisoners of war from Soviet Russia that were killed there. And I never believed that there were gas chambers, but there were gas chambers, but they were for those prisoners of war to do away with them. So, you know, and that was still during the war. But, and, you know, that, so Carol is our expert on movies. So we saw the movie The Lives of Others, which was about life in the East, and the constant surveillance and the fear that generated. So, and I was always glad that the Nazis did not have the means to watch you all the time, as the government has now. Yes.
I'm a Polish Jew,
Yes.
and I went to visit Auschwitz, and I got on my knees and I kissed the ground.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's there.
Yes. And, you know, the interesting thing occurred to me about Auschwitz and the other extermination camps, giving them the right label, right? They were originally not part of Germany. They were outside Germany, in Poland, for instance, or in other countries. And so the population could say, we don't know about them, even when they did. And so, and you know, so what are we doing today outside of this country? where we don't see, where we take prisoners. And so, yes, so, no, I honor your pain. I honor your pain.
Harriet, I want to thank you for sharing your story. One of the ways, one of the actions people take is to tell the stories, which is what you're doing and what you've done. And the stories are painful. And this is hard to hear, isn't it? And it feels really real right now. And the story, the message that you brought, Harriet, that was so clear when you met with Sarah and I was, I need to tell this story because we've been here before and we know what to do when we're here. We know what to do when we're here. We gather, we make community, we protect each other, we find our groups, we find our people, and we listen to our elders who have the stories to tell of what we do now. So Harriet, thank you, and thank you all who came together today to hear this.
Yes.
And
Thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
If you want to know more, I don't want to flog my book, but there is
Talk to Harriet
the book
about
is
her
at
book.
Browser's
Absolutely.
Independent Bookstore.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
the library
They
to
have
get some
one copy, but
Great.
I offered to give them more.
So it's our practice to also extinguish a chalice when we are done with words that will send us on our way. Like the flame of the chalice, may the flame in our hearts burn, remain unextinguished. May it ignite our energies, our drive, our resolve to dream, to build, and to live into the world in which good exists, for now which might only be in our imagining. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Harriet.
Thank you. Can I hug you? May I hug you?